If you remember our first video, we had this issue of creating a new user, and the way we had sorted it out at that time by adding an exception in our security configuration. So if you go and look at it, this is our exception, and basically what we had said is that any post request coming into /user endpoint should just ignore any authentication. Now to try out, it is a good idea, but if you are building a proper product, this is probably not something that you want to do, because that leaves that particular endpoint vulnerable for any kind of attacks. Ideally, we want role based access control to be operating on that particular endpoint as well. So how we are going to solve it? We understand that when a new user is going to be created, at that point in time you are definitely going to have a username and password in the context. So basically what we want to do is we look at our username and password principle that we had created and do some modifications so that it can actually handle this scenario where we want to be able to create a brand new user. So if you really look at it, the only two things that we need is the username and password. Actually, we don't even need password. What we really want is a mechanism to set in the security context the right roles. So let's go and look at our principle that we had defined for this particular purpose, and we had used this username and password principle. So now let's add a flag in this so that we can mark it whether it's a new user or not. So what we are going to do is private final boolean is new user, and let's define a getter and setter for it. Actually only getter, we don't need setter, we can't define a setter because it's final. And then we define in the original constructor that we had passed, we can just say this dot is new user equal to false, because if we are providing the password, it's not the new user. But we define another alternative to this, where if you only provide a username and not the password, we will set the password to null, basically empty, and the new user will be set to true. So now that we have this particular constructor defined and this class defined, let's go to our filter. Now if you see in our filter, right now we have put a specific condition that if it is authenticate, then we go and do all this stuff that is related to creating a new user. What we want to do is we also want to do something similar if basically if we are calling a new user and we know the new user is nothing but /user along with the method as post. And so basically what we want to do is if the method is post, we want to be able to, so let me just find out what is the type for method. I mean, I don't want to use a string, I am just trying to find the class that can give me that method, otherwise we will okay, let's start by putting the post as a method in string, and then we will see if there is a class available there or there is a variable available that we can use. So basically, if you see, what we are saying is along with the authenticate, if the URI is user as then the method is post, then we know this is a scenario where we are creating a new user. So these two, this I think we can just make it off nullable just in case, because now the password could be null. So now we are checking, we know that this is the principle in the case of authenticate, but if we have this other scenario which we had just defined, then the principal definition will change, and we basically want it to just contain only username, and we know this will set it to have a user set to be true. So now if you see, what we have done here is this: if the URI is authenticate, then we expect both the username and password. If the URI is /user and method is post, then we only expect username and it is a new user creation request. So now we have modified our principle to take care of the new user scenario, and now what we can do is we have to handle the processing of it within the provider. So let's go and look at our provider. Now in provider, if you see, we are doing all this. This is the processing in case of authenticate endpoint. So we can check if principal dot is new user. If it is a new user, then we know that we have to do something else, and let's cut copy paste this thing for simplicity reason, and we will modify it to help us. So if you see here, if the principal is new user, then we get username, we won't get password. We find the user by username from within the database, and if it is present, then we can just return an error, because this will be a duplicate user. So we can just say throw new user already exists, and then we can pass it a string saying that user percentage already exists, and then we can put username here. So this is this. Oh, this guy needs email as well as so we need to define another constructor here that only takes a username. So let's remove this email option, and then we can say duplicate username and we pass the username here, and we remove the email thing, we don't need it, and let's go here. So we came back to this place. No, this is the endpoint, so we need to go to the other place here, and we don't need to give this string dot format because the message is being constructed in the exception inside. So we did this. Else, if the user does not exist, then this is where we are going to do a magic. What we are going to do is, even though we know this user doesn't exist, but we will successfully authenticate it within the database, so that the Spring thinks that the user exists. But what we are going to do is, we will only pass one role, which is a new user role, and this new user role will be allowed to perform only one function, that is to create a new user. It won't be able to do anything else. So this is how we are going to guard the security. Basically what we will do is, the endpoint that creates a new user will not be allowed to do anything else except create a serve the requests that are coming it with a new user role, and that way we can make sure that nobody can misuse it. So if it is a new user, we just get the username, make sure it does not exist within the table, and then if it does not exist, we let it to be authenticated from the security context. We don't check it in the database because we know it does not exist. So now we can go ahead and add another role called new user, and mask would be 5. And we can pass the integer value, because, or we can pass the list. So we can say arrays dot as list this particular role, and we can put this thing in the else clause. So now that we have fixed our provider, so now the request will be sent off to the endpoint, and now we need to make sure that the endpoint takes care of it. One of the things that we need to handle in the endpoint that we have not really handled yet is that authenticated user should be same as username that is specified within the JSON packet. Because if you remember, we are authenticating the user from the header. Whatever is coming in the header, that is how we are authenticating it, and that is a user that needs to be same user into the JSON packet that will hit the endpoint. So now let's go to the endpoint. So we go to user endpoint. Now in this, the create user is here. So first thing that we want to do is, we want to add a pre-authorized on it. And in pre-authorized, what we want to say is has, or we will basically define a let's define a new annotation for it, and for now it's call it new user creation authentication. So this will be our role and we will define it in a moment. Now here what we are going to do is, we know there is an authenticated user now. So first we get that. So we can do, we know we can just pass a authentication in the injected there and it will be populated. So now we can say authentication dot get principal, and we know this principal has to be the username and password principal. So username password principal equal to username password principal dot class dot cast. So we cast this class to the appropriate value, and then principal dot get username will basically give us the username. So we say string username equal to principal dot get username dot get. Now we just check if the username that we got in the security context is not equal to the username that we have got within the entity. Now if this is the case, not email, we have to say username. If this is the case, then we throw the exception back, throw new user entity exists, and we pass username. We have to define a new exception here. So let's say user creation failure and user creation exception username mismatch exception, and we pass both the usernames here, and we will define this exception in a moment. So this is one thing done, and now we also need to make sure that the email is not being repeated, which is already being taken care of here. So after that I think this is all right. So now we need to define two things. One thing is we need to define this annotation. So let's go and let's define the annotation. And let's copy some annotation. Let's take this guy. So basically what we want, it has authority, has any authority. An admin should be able to create a user, but that would be a separate endpoint. So this will only be allowed for a new user authority, and I think this should be enough. Now we have to create this exception. So let's go to the exception directory. We take one of the existing exceptions and just make a copy of it and rename it to the new class. And basically within this exception we are going to have two usernames. So let's call it string username 1 and then another username 2, or let's call it username in header and username in body, and then we can say here rather than not found, just this should have conflict as a type, and then we can pass both the strings here. First is in header and second is in body, and then we can say username in header and body, and after header we can do a percentage, and after body also we can do a percentage. And let's call it username in header comma username in body. So we construct this message, and then we can just do this dot username in header equal to username in header, this dot username in body equal to username in body. So we have it. We can create a getter methods. Let's make them final. Oh, we have to initialize in this other case as well. So, oh, this we can't. We can just get rid of it actually. No, we can't, because this exception has to be converted to. Okay, let's get rid of this final, and let's generate getter and setter methods on it. And this is our exception class. Now let's go back to user endpoint. So here we are doing this. So I think now we are all set. Now the only thing that we need to do is go back to our security configuration and remove that security bypass that we had added. So let's go to security configuration, and we get rid of /user here. Now let's run it, and let's get our postman back. Okay, so the server is up and running. So here we got our postman, and let's pull out one of the create user requests, which is one of the posts with the user. These are all get, yeah, this one. So this is our request. Let's go to the header, and let's now add a, we have to add a username now, X username, let's call it user3, and let's go to the body, let's call it user3, 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 3 hash 1 2 3 4. Now let's send the request. So this user got created. Now let's also make sure that authentication works. So let's get a authentication and let's say in the header, let's say X username is user3, password is user3 hash 1234, and the body again it should be user3 user3 hash 1234. Let's send the request. Somehow it is getting a user2 because in header we have given the wrong value. Now let's go and do it again. Yeah, so it authenticates. So now with this you can see that we can actually have a kind of a open endpoint without having to completely disable security for that endpoint. And the benefit of it is that it provides the additional function of restricting the endpoints to be useful only with certain roles, and those roles we control, the administrators control, and that way we can make our server more secure. So I hope you like this video. If you have liked this video, please subscribe, click on the bell icon, comment if you want to learn something else about cloud or Spring Framework, and keep an eye on for additional videos that we will be posting. Thank you for watching.